A lonely millionaire's pet dog suddenly barked loudly one stormy night. When he went out to check on the situation, his eyes widened when he discovered that it was not a thief, but... The rain was relentless, a steady percussion against the towering glass panes of Mark Whitmore's study. It came in waves, tapping lightly before lashing out again, as if uncertain whether to whisper or to rage. The glow from his desk lamp cast elongated shadows across the oak table, the only warmth in an otherwise vast and hollow room. Mark rubbed his temple, eyes flicking between the financial reports spread before him. Numbers blurred together, merging into one indistinguishable mass. He wasn't tired, not exactly, just unmotivated. Another late night, another set of problems to solve, another deal to close. It was all the same, a pattern he had followed long enough to mistake it for purpose. Then, the bark. Short, sharp, insistent. Mike. Mark's head snapped up, the fine hairs on his arms rising instinctively. Mike never barked, at least not without reason. The dog, a German shepherd with greying fur around his snout, was lying near the fireplace just moments ago, his usual spot since another bark, deeper this time. A growl followed, low and warning. Mark pushed back from his chair, the scrape of wood against marble swallowed by the storm outside. His bare feet met the cold floor, the chill seeping through his skin as he moved toward the door. The hallway was dimly lit, the sconces casting long, flickering streaks along the polished walls. Mike stood rigid near the entrance, his body tense, ears pricked forward. His eyes, sharp, intelligent, didn't leave the doorframe. Mark's stomach tightened. He unlocked the heavy oak door and pulled it open, bracing against the sudden gust of wind. The scent of rain and wet earth rushed in, mingling with the cool air that curled around his ankles. But there was no one outside, only the dark, empty driveway, the gates locked shut beyond the rows of hedges swaying violently in the wind. Then he saw it. A bundle, small, unmoving, nestled in the corner, barely visible against the stone porch. For a moment, Mark did not move. The world around him shrank, the sound of the rain muffled into a dull hum. A child. Here. His fingers curled at his sides, then released. One slow step. Another. He knelt, heart pounding against his ribs as he reached for the fabric. The cloth was soaked, thin enough that when he peeled it back, the weight in his chest only grew heavier. Tiny. Too tiny. A newborn. The baby's skin was pale, his lips a faint shade of blue. His breathing was barely perceptible, shallow and uneven. He did not cry. The wind howled through the trees. Mark exhaled sharply and scooped the child up, cradling the frail body against his chest. He was cold. His fingers, curled into small fists, were like ice. "Damn it," Mark muttered under his breath, retreating inside. Mike followed closely, his movements cautious but alert, as if aware of the fragility in Mark's arms. Inside, the warmth of the house wrapped around them, but it wasn't enough. Not nearly enough. Mark moved swiftly through the hallway, heading toward the nearest fireplace. He laid the baby on the plush couch, grabbing the thick woolen throw draped over the armrest. His hands weren't steady as he wrapped the child securely, tucking the edges around his tiny frame. Still, no sound, no cries. Mark hovered, his breath shallow. He should call someone. Who? His mind ran through possibilities, but the idea of leaving the child alone, even for a second, felt impossible. Instead, he reached out, hesitated, then placed a hand against the baby's chest. The rise and fall was faint, but it was there. The child stirred slightly, his eyelids fluttering. Mark exhaled a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. Mike sat beside the couch, ears twitching, watching. "Where did you come from?" Mark murmured, not expecting an answer. He leaned forward, searching the fabric once more. A small envelope was tucked between the folds, damp but intact. With careful fingers, He pulled it out, unfolded it. The ink had smudged in places, but the words were still legible. His name is Jose. Please, keep him safe. No signature, no explanation, just a plea, written in a hurried, desperate hand. Mark sat back, running a hand through his hair. There was no mistaking it. This wasn't an accident. Whoever had left the baby here had done so for a reason. Outside, the rain continued to fall. Inside, the weight of the moment settled heavy in Mark's chest. Jose. The name felt foreign in his mouth, but something about it, about him, made it impossible to ignore. For the first time in a long while, Mark didn't think about the late-hour reports or the deals waiting on his desk. Instead, he reached for his phone. "Dr. Reynolds," he said as soon as the line connected. His voice was steady, but beneath it was something else, something he didn't quite recognize. "I need you to come over. Now." He hung up. Then, with a slow, measured breath, he looked down at the baby once more. Jose's tiny fingers twitched against the thick wool, his breath no longer as faint as before. He was safe, for now. But the questions remained, lingering in the dim glow of the fireplace. Who had left him here? And what kind of danger were they running from? The storm had softened overnight, though remnants of it clung to the world outside. Rain still trickled from the gutters, a quiet metronome against the silence of the house. The air smelled of damp earth and pine, a mix of renewal and decay. Mark sat in the leather chair near the fireplace, a half-empty glass of scotch resting on the table beside him. He hadn't touched it in a while. The flames cast flickering shadows across the room, chasing the exhaustion from his face, but doing little to ease the weight pressing against his chest. Upstairs, the baby, Jose, slept soundly. Mark had checked more times than he wanted to admit. Each visit met with the steady rise and fall of a tiny chest, the occasional soft murmur that reminded him Jose was real, not just some strange fever dream conjured by the storm. He exhaled, rubbing his fingers against his temple. Who leaves a newborn on a doorstep in the middle of the night? The question gnawed at him, the lack of answers more unsettling than the situation itself. Then there was Mike, restless. The dog, usually content to curl up by the fire at this hour, paced near the front door. His ears twitched, head tilting toward the outside world as if something beyond the walls had unsettled him. Mark sighed, finishing the last sip of his drink before pushing himself up. "What is it now?" Mike didn't respond, but his body stiffened. His nose flared. Something was out there. Mark grabbed the nearest jacket and stepped into the cold morning. The rain had dwindled into a soft drizzle, barely more than a mist, but the ground remained slick beneath his bare feet as he stepped onto the grass. And then he saw her, a crumpled figure near the garden fence. For a moment, Mark thought it might be some stray animal, some poor creature caught in the storm, but as he stepped closer, the details became unmistakable. A woman, soaked to the bone, her clothes torn, her arms curled protectively around herself. The wind shifted, and he caught the metallic scent of blood. Shit! His voice was barely above a whisper. Mike reached her first, sniffing cautiously, before looking back at Mark as if waiting for him to act. Mark hesitated. Twice in 24 hours. First the child, now this. A rational man would call the police. A sensible man wouldn't invite another unknown into his home, wouldn't pick up a broken woman the way he had cradled an abandoned child just hours before. But Mike wasn't barking. Instead, the dog simply stood by her side, ears forward but relaxed, waiting. That was enough. Mark crouched, brushing strands of wet hair away from the woman's face. She was young, maybe early 30s, her skin too pale beneath the streaks of mud and rain. Her lips trembled. Even unconscious, her body was curled tight, as if still trying to fight off something unseen. "Hey," he murmured, his voice uncharacteristically soft. "Can you hear me?" No response. He placed 2 fingers against the pulse at her neck, weak but steady. Her breathing was shallow, uneven, her damp clothes sticking to her skin. She wouldn't last long in this cold. Mark didn't think. He simply acted. Sliding his arms beneath her, he lifted her with ease. She was lighter than she should have been, malnourished. His chest tightened at the realization. By the time he carried her inside, droplets of water trailed across the polished floors, darkening the wood beneath his steps. He moved quickly, laying her on the living room couch, grabbing a blanket from the chair nearby. The fire crackled in protest as he adjusted the logs, coaxing more warmth into the space. Mike sat beside the couch, watchful. Mark shook his head. "You keep finding strays," he muttered, running a hand through his hair. The woman stirred, her fingers twitching against the fabric of the couch, but her eyes remained closed. Mark exhaled sharply, rubbing the back of his neck before pulling his phone from his pocket. Dr. Reynolds was going to love this. The line barely rang before the doctor picked up. "This better not be about a pulled muscle again," Reynolds said, voice groggy with sleep. "It's not," Mark replied. There was a beat of silence, then a sigh. "God damn it, Whitmore. What is it this time?" Mark glanced at the unconscious woman. "I need you to come over." Reynolds groaned. "Another business emergency." "No." Mark pinched the bridge of his nose. "A woman, injured, unconscious. Found her outside near the fence." A pause. Then, "Jesus, you running a shelter now?" Mark didn't dignify that with an answer. "Fine," Reynolds muttered. "Give me 20 minutes. Try not to adopt anyone else before I get there." Mark ended the call and let out a breath. He leaned against the armrest of the chair, watching the woman's face, searching for something, anything, that might give him a clue as to who she was. Nothing. Just another mystery. Another stray left on his doorstep. Mike rested his head on his paws, watching Mark as if waiting for him to make sense of it all. Mark exhaled, stretching his shoulders before heading toward the kitchen. If this morning was going to be anything like last night, he'd need coffee. Strong coffee. The first thing Marilyn felt was warmth. It wrapped around her, unfamiliar and disorienting after the long, merciless cold. Then came the scent, antiseptic and burning wood. A fire crackled somewhere close, the sound distant but grounding. Pain followed. A slow, creeping ache curled around her ribs, her arms, the sharp sting on her temple. She stirred, and immediately, a pulse of fear rushed through her. "Where am I?" She opened her eyes. The world was blurred at first. The ceiling above her was high, wooden beams stretching across it. The light was dim, the room lined with bookshelves, a fireplace casting soft, flickering shadows. Then she saw him. A man leaned against the doorway, arms crossed, watching her carefully. Tall, dark-haired, sharply dressed, even in his casual stance. His expression unreadable, his presence far too controlled for someone who had just taken in a stranger. Panic surged, and she tried to sit up too fast. The room spun. "Easy," Mark said, stepping forward. "You took a beating. No need to add a concussion to the list." She flinched instinctively. Too close. Mark stopped. He had seen that reaction before. His gaze flickered with something, understanding maybe. He stepped back, keeping a respectable distance. "You're safe," he said. "No one is going to hurt you here." Marilyn pressed her palms against the couch, grounding herself. Her fingers curled into the fabric as she took slow, shallow breaths. Safe. The word had lost its meaning a long time ago. Then she saw the bassinet. Her breath caught. Near the fireplace, small and fragile, lay Jose, sleeping, warm, breathing. A strangled sound escaped her throat. Relief crashed over her, sudden and overwhelming. He was alive. Tears welled before she could stop them. Mark didn't speak. He only watched. She wiped her face roughly, swallowing past the knot in her throat. The shame of breaking down in front of a stranger burned under her skin, but she didn't care. Jose was alive. That was all that mattered. Mark let the silence stretch before speaking again. Dr. Reynolds was here. You lost a lot of blood, but nothing life-threatening. You should rest. She turned to him, studying him properly for the first time. The sharp jawline, the tired eyes, the way he stood, not stiff, but guarded. Who are you? Her voice was rough, barely above a whisper. Mark Whitmore, he said simply. This is my house. Marilyn exhaled shakily. Of course. She had memorized his name, read about him, even before everything had fallen apart. She looked down at her trembling hands. She had no right to be here, in his home, taking his kindness. But she had no choice. Her throat tightened. Mark didn't push. He moved toward the chair across from her, sitting down like he had all the patience in the world. Take your time, he said. She closed her eyes briefly, gathering herself. Then, finally, she spoke. I was a housekeeper, she began, voice hoarse. Worked for Vincent Kennedy for 3 years. The name alone made her chest tighten. I was good at my job, kept my head down, never caused trouble. Mark remained still, but his attention sharpened. Kennedy. I thought... She hesitated, swallowed. I thought I understood how dangerous he was, but I didn't. Not until it was too late. The fire crackled softly, but Mark said nothing. He was waiting. Marilyn let out a slow, unsteady breath. He was careful. He didn't get his hands dirty, not in ways people could prove. But I lived there. I saw things, heard things, and one day, I saw too much. Mark's jaw tightened. Marilyn clenched her fingers, staring at them as if they held the answer to everything. He had women brought in, not guests, not lovers, just business transactions. Some of them never left. A shiver crawled down her spine. I walked in on him one night. He didn't see me, but I saw her, a girl, barely younger than me, terrified out of her mind. She was trying to run, but his men dragged her back. Marilyn's breath hitched. I knew then. I knew what he was. Mark's expression darkened, but he still didn't interrupt. After that, he started noticing me. More than before. Marilyn's voice turned brittle. I became his next interest, and when he wants something, he doesn't take no for an answer. She forced herself to look at Mark. That's how Jose happened. Something flickered in Mark's eyes. It wasn't pity. It was worse. Recognition. Like he had always known men like Vincent existed, men who took and took until nothing was left. Marilyn looked away. I kept my head down. I thought, if I didn't fight back, if I stayed quiet, he'd lose interest. A hollow laugh escaped her lips. I was wrong. Her hands curled into fists. When Jose was born, he didn't even acknowledge him. I thought that meant we were safe. But I should have known better. Her voice dropped lower. 3 days ago, I overheard something I wasn't meant to hear. About you. Mark stiffened. Marilyn exhaled shakily. You're on his list. He wants you gone. Mark's expression didn't change, but she could feel the shift in the air. He's been digging into you for months. I don't know why, but whatever it is, it's personal. Silence stretched between them. Finally, Marilyn spoke again. I had to run. I had Jose. I couldn't let him grow up under that monster. She met Mark's gaze. I ran toward you, but his men were already on me. I had to leave Jose at your door first. If I got caught, at least he'd be safe. Mark stared at her, his face unreadable. Then, without a word, he stood and walked to the window. The rain had finally stopped. You barely made it, he said, his voice quieter than before. They were close, weren't they? Marilyn nodded. I lost them by dawn. Mark ran a hand down his face. Vincent Kennedy. A name he had crossed paths with before, but now it was different. Now it was personal. The fire had burned low, its embers glowing faintly in the dimly lit room. Outside, the rain had finally stopped, but the cold still clung to the air, wrapping itself around the walls of Mark Whitmore's house, like an unwelcome guest. The weight of Marilyn's words lingered between them, heavier than the silence that followed. Mark leaned back in his chair, his fingers interlaced, his mind calculating. He had always known Vincent Kennedy was ruthless, a man who saw people as tools, assets to be used and discarded. But this was a different kind of monster. You're sure? His voice was quiet, controlled, but something simmered beneath it. Marilyn sat stiffly on the couch, her hands clasped together as if holding herself together. Yes. Mark studied her, the sharp lines of her face carved by exhaustion. Her skin was still pale, but there was something steady in her gaze now. She had spoken the truth, at least the truth as she knew it. Why me? He asked. Marilyn exhaled shakily. I don't know, but I heard your name. Vincent was talking to someone, one of his men, I think. He wasn't giving orders. He was waiting, like someone else was making the call. Mark's jaw tightened. That was worse. Vincent wasn't just coming after him, he was waiting for permission. Marilyn rubbed her arms absently, as if trying to chase away a lingering chill. I didn't stay long enough to hear the rest. I'd already pushed my luck too far. Mark tapped his fingers against the armrest, staring into the fire. And now you're here. I had nowhere else to go. Her voice was quiet, but there was no pleading in it, no desperation, just fact. Mark didn't respond. He wasn't sure how he felt about that. For years, he had kept his life tightly controlled, each decision measured, each risk calculated. And now, within 24 hours, he had a newborn in his house and a woman on the run from a man powerful enough to make people disappear. You still haven't answered the most important question, he said finally. Marilyn frowned slightly. Can I trust you? A flicker of something crossed her face. Hurt, maybe, but it was gone as quickly as it had come. I don't expect you to, she said, but I didn't come here to betray you. I came because I had nowhere else to go, because Jose deserves better than the life Vincent would give him. Mark let out a slow breath, watching her carefully. She had been careful with her words, but he noticed what she hadn't said. She hadn't come here to save herself. She had come to save her son. That more than anything made him believe her. You said Vincent's men were on you when you got here, he said, shifting gears. They lost you. But for how long? Marilyn's expression darkened. I don't know. I made sure I wasn't followed, but I can't promise they won't find this place. He has resources. He has people everywhere. Mark sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. Great. Marilyn hesitated before speaking again. There's more. Mark looked up, waiting. She swallowed, her fingers tightening around the blanket draped over her lap. Vincent isn't just looking for me. There's someone else. Someone still in his house. A friend. Mark's patience was thinning, but he forced himself to listen. Sarah, Marilyn said. She worked for Vincent too. She faltered for the first time. She's still in there. And if he finds out I ran, I don't know what he'll do to her. Mark ran his tongue over his teeth, considering his next words carefully. Let me guess, he said. You want me to help you get her out? Marilyn looked away, her fingers digging into the fabric of the couch. I know what I'm asking, she said finally. I know it's dangerous. But I also know you don't like men like him any more than I do. Mark didn't answer immediately. He didn't need to. He had already made his decision. But trust was something different entirely. He stood, walking to the window, watching the darkened yard beyond the glass. "We'll figure it out," he said finally. "But first, we make sure this house is safe." Marilyn blinked, as if unsure she had heard him correctly. "You believe me?" Mark turned, meeting her gaze. "I believe Vincent is dangerous. I believe you know what he's capable of." His voice lowered slightly. "And I believe he's not done yet." Marilyn exhaled, tension leaving her shoulders for the first time since she had woken up. For now, that was enough. But Mark knew better than anyone. The worst was yet to come. Morning settled over the house in soft, muted shades of grey. The storm had passed, but the sky remained overcast, heavy with the weight of lingering clouds. The air smelled fresh, rain-soaked earth mixed with the distant scent of pine drifting through the open windows. It should have been a peaceful morning, but peace didn't exist here anymore. Mark sat at the dining table, staring into his untouched cup of coffee. The steam curled lazily, dissipating into the cool air. He wasn't tired. He had moved past exhaustion into something else entirely. His thoughts churned, replaying Marilyn's words from the night before. Vincent Kennedy. His name. His list. His control. Mark had dealt with powerful men before. Cutthroat executives, corrupt politicians, men who built their empires on the bones of others. But Vincent wasn't like them. He wasn't satisfied with merely winning. He wanted control over people, over lives, over everything. Mark tightened his grip around the mug, his jaw tensing. From the kitchen, the quiet sound of running water and the clinking of porcelain filled the silence. Marilyn moved with slow, deliberate steps, still weak but refusing to be idle. She had insisted on making tea, brushing off his offer to help with nothing more than a quiet shake of her head. She didn't want to feel useless. He understood that. A small noise from the living room pulled both of their attention. Jose, a soft coo, the kind only a newborn could make, followed by a gentle stirring from the bassinet near the fireplace. Marilyn turned immediately, setting the kettle aside and walking over. Mark watched as she carefully picked up the baby, pressing him against her shoulder, whispering something he couldn't hear. The relief on her face was subtle but real. Mark ran a hand down his face, exhaling. He had to focus. Pulling out his phone, he scrolled through his contacts before settling on a name. Henry Bishop. Mark tapped the call button and held the phone to his ear. The line barely rang twice before a voice answered. "Mark Whitmore. Didn't expect to hear from you this early. What, your stocks tanked overnight?" Mark smirked slightly. Same old Henry. Wish it was that simple. A pause. Henry wasn't an idiot. He could read between the lines. That bad? Mark glanced toward Marilyn and Jose. She wasn't listening, but he lowered his voice anyway. "I need you to dig into Vincent Kennedy." Silence. Then, "Christ, Mark. You don't start small, do you?" "Can you do it?" "Of course I can do it," Henry muttered, followed by the sound of a chair creaking. He was probably sitting up now, his usual relaxed demeanor fading into something sharper. "But you don't poke around Kennedy's business without getting burned. What am I looking for?" "People," Mark said. "People trapped in his house, people he won't let go." Henry swore under his breath. "Give me a few hours. If there's something to find, I'll find it. But Mark," he hesitated, "if you're in this deep, you better be ready. Vincent doesn't play fair." Mark didn't need the warning. He had already crossed the line. "Just get me what you can," he said, before ending the call. When he turned back, Marilyn was watching him, her expression cautious. "You trust him?" she asked. Mark nodded. "Henry's been doing this a long time. If Vincent has skeletons in his closet, he'll find them." Marilyn exhaled, shifting Jose in her arms. "And when he does?" Mark leaned against the counter, crossing his arms. "Then we act. A knock on the front door made them both tense. Mark frowned. That was fast. Marilyn instinctively held Jose closer, her grip tightening. "It's Henry," Mark reassured her, walking toward the door. He unlocked it and pulled it open. Henry Bishop stood there, dressed in his usual worn leather jacket, his hands shoved into his pockets. He looked the same as always, lean, sharp-eyed, with the kind of face that made people either trust him or instinctively check their wallets. "You work fast," Mark said, stepping aside to let him in. Henry smirked. "Not my first time digging into bastards like Kennedy." The smirk faded as he pulled out a worn folder from his bag. He tossed it onto the table, the pages inside shifting slightly with the movement. "You're not going to like what's in there," he said grimly. Mark opened the folder, his eyes scanning the contents. Photos, documents, evidence, more than he had expected. He felt Marilyn step closer, peering over his shoulder. She stiffened. A grainy black and white photo stared back at them. Sarah. She was standing in the shadows of Vincent's estate, half hidden, her posture rigid with tension. A guard stood nearby, his stance too close, too controlling. Mark didn't miss the way Marilyn's breath hitched. "She's still in there," Henry said, "and if we don't move fast, she won't be for long." Mark exhaled slowly, closing the folder, pressing his fingers against his temple. "How bad?" he asked. Henry's expression darkened. "Bad. She's not just a loose end. She's leverage. Vincent knows Marilyn ran. He's not stupid. He'll use Sarah to draw her back in. And if that doesn't work..." He hesitated. "He'll make sure she never talks." Marilyn's hands trembled. She clenched her fists to stop them. Mark stared down at the table, the weight of it all settling deep in his chest. This wasn't just a situation anymore. This was a fight. He looked at Marilyn, then at Henry. "We get her out," Mark said, his voice steady, "no matter what it takes." Henry nodded, but his expression was grim. "Then you better prepare yourself, because once we make a move, there's no going back." Mark already knew that. There was never any going back. The night stretched long. Mark sat in his study, the dim light from his desk lamp casting deep shadows against the walls. The worn folder Henry had given him lay open before him, pages of evidence spread across the polished wood, documents, reports, photos, undeniable proof of Vincent's crimes. His fingers tightened around the edge of a report, but his mind wasn't on the details. It was on what came next. Vincent was untouchable in the traditional sense. Too many connections, too much money, the wrong move, and Sarah wouldn't make it out alive. Mark exhaled through his nose, rubbing his fingers against his temple. There was no room for error. A quiet knock pulled him from his thoughts. Marilyn stood in the doorway, one arm wrapped around herself, the dim light making her look smaller than she was. "I can't sleep," she admitted. Mark gestured to the chair across from him, and she hesitated before stepping inside. He noticed how her fingers gripped the back of the seat before she finally lowered herself into it, as if bracing for something. For a while, neither of them spoke. The fire in the corner crackled softly, filling the silence between them. Finally, Marilyn let out a breath. "I need to say something." Mark set his pen down and leaned back, waiting. She didn't meet his eyes. Instead, she stared at the papers on his desk, at the blurred image of Sarah, her expression unreadable. "I didn't want to have him." Her voice was quiet, flat. Mark frowned slightly. "Who?" Marilyn let out a bitter laugh. "Jose." She looked up then, her eyes filled with something too raw to name. "I didn't want him. When I found out I was pregnant, I hated myself. I hated him. Because he was his mark, didn't move. I thought about running. I thought about..." She exhaled shakily. "I couldn't bear the idea of bringing his child into the world. Every time I looked in the mirror, all I saw was Vincent, His control, his cruelty, his blood running through my veins. Her voice cracked. I wanted to hate him. Mark stayed silent, letting her speak. But then he was born. She swallowed hard. And he wasn't Vincent. He wasn't anything like him. He was small, innocent, and he looked at me like I was his whole world. And I knew I couldn't let that man have him. Her hands clenched in her lap. I ran because of Jose. Because I didn't want him to grow up like me. Always afraid. Always looking over his shoulder. I didn't care what happened to me. I still don't. She met Mark's gaze then, steady and unwavering. But I'll die before I let Vincent take him. A long silence settled between them. Mark could feel the weight of her words, the exhaustion in them, the quiet confession of a woman who had spent her entire life fighting against a force too big to conquer. He didn't say anything like "I understand," because he didn't. He had never lived in fear of a man like Vincent, never had to make the impossible choices Marilyn had made, but he understood what it meant to protect something. And so, he did the only thing he could. He reached forward and slid a single piece of paper toward her. It was a rough sketch of Vincent's estate, the layout, security placements, entrances and exits. Marilyn frowned. "What is this?" Mark's voice was quiet but firm. "A plan." She blinked at him, her breath catching slightly. "You think I don't want to go charging in there?" he said. "I do. But if we go in blind, Sarah dies. Maybe we die with her." He leaned forward, tapping the paper. "We do this right. We make sure everyone gets out alive." Marilyn exhaled, gripping the paper between her fingers. "You think we can?" Mark's grip on his pen tightened. "We have to." For a long moment, Marilyn just looked at him, something shifting in her expression. When she spoke again, her voice was quieter, softer. "Thank you," she said. Mark didn't respond. He only nodded, his fingers tightening slightly on the edge of the desk. Outside, the wind howled against the windows, but inside, the air was still. The plan was forming, and soon it would begin. The morning was still, too still. Mark stood by the window in his study, watching the driveway with quiet suspicion. The overcast sky stretched endlessly above the estate, the cold air thick with something unspoken. A storm was coming. Down the hall, Marilyn was tucking Jose into the bassinet. Mark had barely spoken to her that morning, but she had sensed it too, the feeling of something shifting, something lurking just beyond their reach. And then, the sound of tires on gravel. Mark's stomach tightened. He's here. The black car rolled to a slow stop in front of the estate. Mark didn't need to see the man stepping out to know who it was. Vincent Kennedy. He inhaled through his nose, exhaling just as slowly. Stay calm. Stay controlled. Turning sharply, he strode down the hallway. Marilyn was already standing in the doorway of the nursery, her face pale. "Upstairs," Mark said, his voice even. "Now." Marilyn hesitated for only a second before nodding. She scooped up Jose, moving quickly toward the second floor. Mark didn't wait to see if she was safe. Instead, he made his way to the front door, schooling his features into a mask of indifference. By the time he opened it, Vincent was already standing there, perfectly poised, hands tucked neatly into the pockets of his tailored coat. "Mark," Vincent greeted, his voice smooth, almost amused. "I hope I'm not intruding." Mark met his gaze, the corners of his mouth lifting in a hollow semblance of a smile. "You always intrude, Vincent. The only question is why." Vincent chuckled. "That's what I've always liked about you, Whitmore. Straight to the point." He tilted his head, eyes flickering toward the open door. "Won't you invite me in?" Mark held his ground. "I wasn't expecting company." "A shame," Vincent murmured. "I would have brought a gift." Every word was laced with something unsaid. A game of chess is played in the open, with moves carefully measured and delivered. Mark exhaled slowly, then stepped aside. "Come in, then." Vincent entered like he owned the place, his eyes scanning the interior with quiet calculation. He didn't sit, didn't make himself comfortable. He was hunting. Mark shut the door and turned to face him, arms crossed. "What do you want?" Vincent smiled, as if Mark had asked something ridiculous. "A conversation, that's all." Mark didn't respond. He waited. Vincent sighed, stepping toward the bookshelves, running his fingers absently along the spines. "You and I have always understood each other, haven't we?" Mark's jaw clenched. "Have we?" Vincent glanced at him, a knowing glint in his eye. "Oh, yes. We both know how the world works. Who controls it? Who bends it to their will?" He tilted his head. "I've always admired that about you, Mark. You don't get sentimental. You don't get distracted." Mark didn't blink. "You sound disappointed." Vincent chuckled, shaking his head. "No, not disappointed." He turned fully, his expression unreadable now. "Just curious." Mark forced himself to remain still. "Curious about what?" Vincent's gaze flickered, just for a second, upstairs. Mark's stomach turned to ice. "I hear things," Vincent said, his tone light. "Rumors, whispers. People come to me when they're looking for something. Or someone." Mark's fingers curled at his sides. "That's funny," he said smoothly, "because I don't recall ever looking for anything from you." Vincent smirked, but the amusement didn't reach his eyes. "No, I don't suppose you have." Silence stretched between them. Then, a small noise. Software barely noticeable. But Vincent noticed. Mark's muscles tensed. From upstairs, Jose had stirred in his sleep, a quiet whimper breaking through the stillness. Mark's mind moved fast. Too fast. He stepped forward, but before Vincent could react, Mike barked. Loud, sharp, immediate. Vincent's gaze snapped toward the sound, but Mike stood in front of the staircase, ears pricked, his entire body tense. A warning, a shield. Mark exhaled through his nose, slow and steady. Vincent chuckled, shaking his head. "Still keeping that beast around, I see." Mark forced a smirk. "He's got good instincts." Vincent's eyes flickered back toward the staircase for just a second longer than necessary. Then finally, he turned away. "Well," he said, adjusting the cuffs of his coat, "I should be going. But let's talk again soon." He stepped toward the door, then paused. Mark could feel it coming. That final, deliberate move. The last chess piece is sliding into place. Vincent glanced over his shoulder, his voice deceptively casual. "Be careful who you let in, Mark." And then, he was gone. Mark shut the door behind him, his heart hammering against his ribs. For a long moment, he didn't move. Then, finally, he turned toward the staircase. Mike was still standing there, ears forward, watching. Upstairs, the house was silent once more. Mark exhaled, running a hand over his face. Vincent knew. He didn't know everything, but he knew enough. And that meant time was running out. The weight of the night pressed down on them. The sky was moonless, a heavy sheet of darkness stretching over the city, swallowing every sound except for the quiet hum of tension. Mark stood at the edge of his study, hands braced against the desk, his gaze locked onto the map spread out before him. Vincent's estate. Every hallway, every entrance, every weak point. Henry stood beside him, flipping through the latest batch of evidence. His jaw was tight, his usual dry humor absent. "This is worse than we thought," Henry muttered, tossing another stack of papers onto the desk. "We're not just dealing with a few dirty secrets. This..." He tapped a blurry surveillance photo of a girl inside Vincent's estate. "This is human trafficking, Mark. Smuggling. Blackmail. People don't walk away from this alive." Mark exhaled through his nose. He had already known, deep down, that it was bad. But hearing it laid out like this, so brutally undeniable, made it settle in his gut like a stone. Across the room, Marilyn sat on the couch, holding a sleeping Jose. Her fingers were curled protectively around the blanket wrapped around him, but her eyes were on Mark. She hadn't spoken much since Henry arrived, just listened, watched. Finally, she broke the silence. "So what do we do?" Henry looked at Mark, waiting. Mark straightened, rolling his shoulders as he met Marilyn's gaze. "We end this," he said simply. She didn't flinch, didn't look away. There was no fear in her eyes anymore. The convoy moved through the night like shadows, unmarked cars weaving through back roads. Headlights dimmed. Henry drove, his fingers tapping absently against the steering wheel, his nerves hidden behind forced nonchalance. Beside him, Mark checked his weapon, the cold weight of it familiar in his grip. The documents Henry collected were enough to convince the police of the plan and send reinforcements. Through the earpiece, a voice crackled. "Teams are in position. Give the word." Mark inhaled slowly. "Wait for my signal," he said. From the back seat, Marilyn shifted, her fingers digging into the fabric of her jeans. She hadn't wanted to come, but she also hadn't wanted to be left behind. "I should be in there," she muttered. Mark turned slightly, his voice low. "You've done your part. Now let us do ours." She pressed her lips together, but didn't argue. Then, through the windshield, the estate came into view. A towering fortress of glass and steel, hidden behind high gates and armed guards. Vincent's kingdom. Mark exhaled slowly. "Let's move." The moment the gates were breached, the world exploded into chaos. Gunshots rang through the night, sharp bursts of violence cutting through the thick silence. Shadows moved in the floodlights, law enforcement sweeping the grounds, taking down Vincent's men one by one. Mark moved with purpose, his steps steady as he pushed forward through the east wing, Henry at his side. Through the chaos, a scream cut through the noise. Sarah. Mark's pulse surged. "Third floor," Henry barked, already moving. Mark followed, boots pounding against the marble floors. They were close. At the end of the hall, a locked door. Henry didn't hesitate. He kicked it open. Inside, Sarah stood pressed against the wall, her wrists bound, her face streaked with tears. A man stood beside her, one of Vincent's enforcers, his gun raised. Mark didn't stop to think. One shot. The man dropped. Sarah gasped, her eyes wide, but Henry was already moving, cutting the bindings from her wrists. "You're safe," he told her, his voice steady. "We're getting you out." Her legs trembled, but she nodded. Mark pressed a hand to his earpiece. "We have her. Moving out now." A voice crackled back. "We got Kennedy." Mark stilled. For a second, the world held its breath. Then, the sound of footsteps, of men being dragged, of the empire crumbling. Mark exhaled. It was over, or so he thought. The estate was a ruin of flashing lights, uniforms, and bodies being hauled into police vans. Vincent Kennedy sat cuffed in the back of one of them, his face unreadable. Mark stood at a distance, watching. Then, Vincent turned his head and smiled. Mark felt the weight of it, the silent warning in that expression. This isn't over. Did Mark forget anything? The wind howled against the windows, rattling the glass as if the night itself sensed what was coming. The storm had passed, but the air remained heavy, thick with something Marilyn couldn't name. She moved through the dimly lit hallway, her arms wrapped tightly around Jose, pressing him close to her chest. The house was too quiet. Mark had left hours ago, gone to finish what they started. He hadn't said it outright, but Marilyn knew. The raid wasn't just about rescuing Sarah. It was about ending Vincent Kennedy. She wanted to believe it was over, that Mark would come back and tell her Vincent was locked away for good. But deep down, she knew men like Vincent didn't go quietly. And then, the noise, the faintest creak of a floorboard, a shift in the air. Mike lifted his head from where he lay by the fireplace, ears pricked, his body going rigid. Marilyn's breath caught, not Mark, not Henry, Vincent's men. Her heart pounded as she turned sharply, moving toward the back entrance, but she barely made it 3 steps before she heard it, the unmistakable click of a gun being cocked. "Don't move." Marilyn froze. Her grip on Jose tightened as she slowly turned. 2 men stood in the shadows near the staircase, their expressions unreadable beneath the dim glow of the hallway light. She swallowed hard, forcing her voice to stay steady. "What do you want?" One of the men smirked. "You know exactly what we want." His eyes flickered toward Jose. "The kid. Hand him over, and maybe we won't hurt you." Marilyn's stomach twisted. "Number no, no, no." She took a slow step backward. "Mark will be back any second." The smirk on the man's face didn't waver. "Mark isn't here." The cold truth settled deep in her bones. She had seconds, maybe less. And then, Mike moved. A snarl ripped through the silence, low and lethal. The men barely had time to react before Mike lunged, his teeth snapping around the arm of the man closest to her. Shit. The man staggered, his grip on the gun faltering. Marilyn ran. She didn't think, just moved. Toward the back of the house, toward the garden. The second man recovered quickly. "Get her!" Marilyn bolted through the kitchen, her breath coming in sharp, ragged gasps. Jose whimpered against her chest, but she didn't stop, didn't dare stop. Behind her, footsteps pounded against the hardwood floor. Faster, faster. The back door burst open, cold night air rushing in as she stumbled onto the damp grass. Her legs burned, exhaustion weighing her down, but she couldn't stop. Not now, not when she was this close. Mike shot past her, barking wildly, leading the way. The bunker. Mark had mentioned it once, barely in passing, a reinforced underground shelter built decades ago, hidden beneath the garden. She had barely paid attention at the time. Now, it was the only chance they had. She ran. The tall grass whipped against her legs, the damp earth sinking beneath her hurried steps. Her vision blurred as she reached the farthest edge of the property. And then, there, the hatch, barely visible beneath layers of ivy and dirt. Marilyn dropped to her knees, one hand clutching Jose, the other fumbling for the latch. Her fingers were slick with sweat, shaking. "Stop!" A voice from behind, close, too close. Marilyn yanked at the hatch, the metal groaning as it gave way. She didn't hesitate. She jumped. The cold, damp air of the bunker swallowed her whole. Mike followed, his body hitting the dirt floor with a heavy thud. Marilyn turned, her breath coming in harsh gasps as she slammed the hatch shut above them. Darkness. Silence. She pressed her back against the wall, Jose clutched tightly in her arms. Her pulse thundered in her ears. Above them, footsteps. Heavy. Searching. They were looking for her. Her fingers dug into the fabric of Jose's blanket as she held her breath, her heart hammering wildly against her ribs. The footsteps stopped. A voice, muffled. Then a thud. Another. They were testing the hatch. Marilyn's stomach twisted. If they found the entrance, if they got through, there was no escape. Jose stirred against her chest, letting out the softest whimper. Marilyn's breath caught. No, no, no. But before the sound could build, Mike moved. A growl rumbled from deep in his chest, low and warning, and then barking, loud, relentless. Marilyn clenched her jaw, pressing a shaking hand over Jose's back as the baby settled against her. Please, please let them think it's just the dog, the voices above murmured. Another heavy footstep, and then silence. Minutes stretched endlessly. Marilyn didn't dare move. Then, the distant sound of tires screeching on pavement. She exhaled sharply. Mark. Mark's fingers tightened around the edge of the desk as he watched the screen. The grainy security footage showed movement near the garden. 2 men, armed, searching. His stomach turned. They were hunting. And Marilyn and Jose were out there, alone. Fear slithered up his spine, foreign and unfamiliar. He had felt anger before, had felt determination, had even felt loss. But this was something else entirely. He grabbed his gun, his voice cold as he turned to Henry. "Drive, now." The wail of police sirens shattered the silence of the estate. Flashing red and blue lights reflected off the wet grass, cutting through the darkness like a beacon. The cavalry had arrived. Mark barely waited for the car to stop before he was out, gun drawn. Henry was right behind him, his own weapon steady as they stormed through the back gate. "Move in," Henry barked to the officers. The scene ahead was pure chaos. Vincent's men, caught off guard, scattered like roaches beneath the floodlights. Shouts rang out, "Drop your weapons!" But some of them didn't listen. Gunfire erupted. Mark barely registered the fight. He had one focus, one thought pounding in his skull. Marilyn. Jose. His breath came short, his pulse hammering against his ribs. His eyes flicked to the security feed on his phone. The garden. The bunker. The two men standing right above it. "They're in the back," he shouted to Henry. They sprinted. Mark reached the garden just as one of the men knelt near the hidden hatch, trying to wrench it open. Not a chance. Mark didn't hesitate. One precise shot to the knee, and the man collapsed with a howl of pain. His partner spun, but Henry was faster. 2 quick shots to the shoulder sent him sprawling. The fight was over in seconds. Mark didn't stop to catch his breath. He was already at the hatch, pulling at the heavy metal handle. It groaned, stuck. "Marilyn!" Mark shouted, his voice raw. Nothing. A second passed. Then, a scraping sound from below. The hatch creaked open, just enough for him to see the pair of wide, terrified eyes staring up at him. Marilyn. Mark exhaled sharply, barely registering his own relief as he yanked the hatch fully open. Marilyn hesitated, her arms tight around Jose, her breath coming in sharp, panicked gasps. "It's me," Mark said, reaching down. "You're safe." Still, she didn't move. Mike was the first to emerge, shaking the dirt from his fur before brushing against Mark's leg, as if telling him to hurry. Finally, Marilyn let out a breath and took his hand. Mark pulled her up, steadying her as she clutched Jose against her chest. The baby stirred, but remained asleep, blissfully unaware of the night's horrors. For a second, neither of them moved. Then, without thinking, Mark did something he never would have expected. He pulled Marilyn into his arms, tightly. She stiffened at first, shocked. Then, slowly, her body relaxed against his. Mark felt her tremble, felt the way her fingers clutched at his jacket as if grounding herself. "You're okay," he murmured against her hair. "You're both okay." Marilyn didn't speak, didn't pull away. She just held on to him, and for the first time in a long time, Mark let himself feel it. Relief. He had almost lost them. The morning air was crisp, the storm finally gone, leaving the estate bathed in soft golden light. The house, though still shaken from the previous night, had returned to some semblance of normalcy. Mark stood in the kitchen, watching the coffee drip into his mug, his thoughts miles away. It was over. Vincent was in custody. His men were either dead or in handcuffs. This should have been the end. But something lingered, something unspoken. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. Mark exhaled and moved to open it, expecting Henry. Instead, he found Sarah. She stood there, her frame thin but steady, her dark eyes filled with emotions too complex to name. For a moment, she said nothing, only looking at him as if trying to find the right words. Then, finally, "Thank you." Mark nodded, stepping aside to let her in. As she entered, her gaze flicked toward the living room, where Marilyn sat on the couch, rocking Jose gently. When Marilyn looked up and saw her, something in her face cracked. A moment later, they were in each other's arms. Mark watched as Marilyn clutched Sarah tightly, whispering something too soft to hear. The raw relief in both women's faces told him more than words ever could. Henry entered from the side door, nodding at Mark. "Well, looks like we actually pulled it off." Mark huffed. "Barely." Henry smirked. Yeah, but a win's a win. Mark glanced at Marilyn and Jose, his expression unreadable. Was it? Because for the first time in his life, winning didn't feel like the end. It felt like the beginning. The air had changed. Winter had loosened its grip, giving way to the slow warmth of spring. The estate, once a place of quiet isolation, had transformed into something else, something alive. Sunlight filtered through the branches of the oak trees, casting dappled shadows over the garden. A soft breeze carried the scent of new blossoms, mixing with the fresh earth. Marilyn applied to be a housekeeper for the Whitmore family. She just needed a safe place for Jose to grow up. She loves this job and is still doing well in everything after her health has been restored for several months now. Mark stood by the patio, coffee in hand, watching. Jose sat on a checkered blanket in the middle of the grass, his tiny hands grasping at the blades, his face scrunched in fascination. He let out a delighted squeal as Mike, ever patient, lay beside him, tail wagging lazily. Nearby, Marilyn knelt beside them, laughing as Jose attempted to grab the dog's ear. Her laughter, light, unrestrained, floated through the air like music. It was a sight Mark hadn't expected. 6 months ago, Marilyn had been running, from danger, from Vincent, from her past. 6 months ago, Jose had been a child hidden in desperation, not playing beneath an open sky. And yet, here they were. He took a slow sip of his coffee, stepping off the patio onto the grass. The ground was firm beneath his feet, grounding him in a way that felt oddly comforting. Marilyn glanced up when she heard his footsteps. "Finally decided to leave your cave," she teased, shielding her eyes from the sunlight. Mark smirked, shaking his head. "Someone's got to keep you two from terrorizing the dog." Mike huffed in agreement, rolling onto his side dramatically. Marilyn grinned. "He loves it. Don't you, boy?" She reached out, scratching behind Mike's ears. Jose let out another high-pitched squeal, waving his hands excitedly. Mark crouched beside them, setting his coffee cup down in the grass. He wasn't sure when it had happened, when this scene had become normal. But it had. Jose turned his wide, curious eyes toward Mark, his chubby fingers reaching. Mark hesitated, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face. Marilyn noticed. "Here," she said softly, carefully lifting the baby and placing him in Mark's arms. Mark stiffened at first, unprepared for the weight, the small warmth against his chest. Jose blinked up at him, babbling nonsense before clumsily grabbing onto Mark's shirt. Mark swallowed. It wasn't the first time he had held the baby. He had carried him inside on that rainy night. He had watched over him when Marilyn was still weak. But this was different. This time, it wasn't out of necessity. This time, he wanted to. "He trusts you," Marilyn murmured, watching the way Jose snuggled into Mark's arms. Mark glanced at her, something unreadable in his expression. "Yeah, guess I'm growing on him." A soft chuckle escaped Marilyn's lips. She stretched out her legs in the grass, tilting her head back to soak in the sun. "I never thought we'd have this," she admitted, voice quieter now. "A place where we don't have to run. A place where he can just be." Mark followed her gaze, watching as Jose let out another giggle, reaching for Mike's fur. It was different now. The shadows that had once clung to them, the fear that had dictated their every move. It wasn't gone, not completely, but it was fading. Mark shifted his grip slightly, adjusting Jose in his arms. "He loves it here," Marilyn said again, this time softer, more to herself than to him. Mark didn't look at her right away. Instead, he kept his eyes on Jose, watching the way the child belonged here without even realizing it. He exhaled, slow and sure. "Then he stays," Mark said simply. Marilyn's breath hitched. She turned to him, her gaze searching, as if trying to see if he meant it. Mark met her eyes. He meant it. No hesitation, no uncertainty. Jose stayed. Marilyn stayed. And so did Mark. For the first time in a long, long time, there was no more running, no more fear. Just this, a new beginning. If this film touches your heart, leave your mark with a like, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel to explore more meaningful stories with us. And if you enjoyed this story, please share it with your friends on WhatsApp. And now, share your feelings with us and tell us your own stories. Every word you share is a building block that helps create our strong and enduring community. Together, we'll create a warm space where everyone can share and connect. Finally, don't miss the incredible stories coming your way soon. We're always here to bring you the best selections, full of deep values, yet entertaining. See you there.